Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire, Episode 114, After Jogaila. Jogaila died on 1st of June 1434. He was probably in his 80s, even allowing for the doubts around when he was actually born, and he had ruled Lithuania for 57 years, and Poland for 46. He'd been on the throne longer than most of his peers had lived, so it was inevitable that his death would have a major impact. This was even more so because, despite his age, his heirs were still minors. Władysław was just 9 years old, and Lithuania was in the middle of a civil war. Olesnitsky was in Poznan on his way to an ecclesiastical council when the news reached him. Above all, he was concerned to avoid another prolonged interregnum, which meant supporting Władysław as heir. But there are several considerations. Śpitak of Melcin the Younger had assembled a group of Malopolska lords who supported the candidacy of Siemowit V over Jogaila's son. The Duke of Mazovia was in his 30s, was a Piast, and his mother Alexandra was the daughter of Algird. In the court itself, Olesnitsky would be up against Sonka and her supporters, who would be looking to rule for the child king. He decided to leave this problem for later. Olesnitsky got ahead of both factions by immediately summoning an assembly of nobles at Poznan, which voted for the election of Władysław as the previously declared successor to Jogaila. He then formed an alliance with Sonka and her party to ensure that the other regional assemblies of nobles also voted for Władysław. Once the boy had been elected king, Olesnitsky was more secure, and he turned his attention to excluding Sonka and her adherents from government. He ensured that the Royal Council, of which he was the leading member, took over the main functions of government. Jan Taszka Koniec-Polski, Sonka's man, was allowed to remain as Chancellor, but the Vice-Chancellor was replaced by Wincenty Kot, tutor to the young princes, an unaligned figure who was acceptable to everyone. This period following the succession was the high point of Olesnitsky's power, although scholars caution that he was not quite so influential as his protégé Długosz describes him. The divisions in the nobility remained, and as long as Władysław was a minor, the government continued to weaken. Olesnitsky was dependent on his brother, the Starosta of Krakow, and Grand Marshal, and a few other key noble families. He was opposed by the Szafranits family, some nobles who felt they had not been given what they owed for supporting Władysław, and their coterie of young and ambitious men that Długosz calls the juniores, who were cultivated by Sonka. Sonka herself was excluded from the regency that she had wanted. To begin with, the succession had little impact on the union. The civil war was still hot, and Žygimantas needed Polish support against Jogaila. As long as he needed support, he was willing to go along with Polish demands. Once Žygimantas won the war at the Sventoye River, the situation changed. Žygimantas did not need Polish help. but he still maintained the Lithuanian claim to Volhynia and Podolia. In 1437, Jogaila decided the time was right for him to play his last hand. He travelled to Krakow and asked for Polish assistance against Zygmuntas, promising in return that his Ruthenian lands in Kiev and elsewhere would pass to Poland upon his death. The Poles agreed to give him Volhynia and Podolia for his lifetime, kicking that problem down the road once again. The settlement between Zygmuntas and Jogaila seemed to show that the union could outlast the decades-long partnership of the cousins who built it, but now things had changed again. Jogaila had frequently visited Lithuania and made a public show of consulting Vytautas and of his respect for Lithuanian government. Władysław was 9. He'd spent his whole life in Poland. He could not travel long distances to intervene in critical issues. Even if he did, he was not about to impose himself on Zygmuntas, a man entering his 70s. Zygmuntas had his own son, Mikolas, already an adult and clearly with his own succession expectations. Zygmuntas took the Polish agreement with Jogaila as a hint that he needed to continue to play ball, and he accepted the message. In late 1437, he signed a new agreement with Olesnicki, confirming the Grodno Agreement and specifying that Mikolas would inherit his father's patrimony, but would have no claim to the throne of the Grand Duke. Soon, however, things got more complicated. Sigismund of Luxembourg had finally realized his ambition of becoming Holy Roman Emperor, but after decades of waiting, he died less than 4 years later. His daughter Elizabeth was married to Albert von Habsburg, who was elected King of Hungary and then Roman Emperor as Albert II in 1438. In Bohemia, the Hussites were still opposed to a German ruler, and this time they asked for Jogaila's second son, Kazimierz. Olesnicki was not in favour, but Sonka was, and some of her juniores led troops into Bohemia to support their cause. Meanwhile, Zygmuntas supported the Bohemian expedition because he was hoping that it would lead to war between Hungary and Poland, and at the same time he was negotiating for an alliance with the Order to join in any such war. In negotiations with Albert and the Order, he represented himself as an independent ruler who had inherited his throne from his brother. Albert liked the idea, but his advisors did not trust the Lithuanians. In any case, the Bohemian force was too small. It was soon defeated, and Albert entered talks with Poland. Zygmuntas wrote to him again, insisting that Lithuania was an independent state, not subject to Polish rule, and that he had inherited the crown from his brother. There was some movement towards an alliance, despite the reluctance of Albert's advisors, but soon Albert was dead, and Zygmuntas had once again to confirm his adherence to Grodno. There was little trust between any of the parties. On the Polish side, Olesnicki and his allies were coming to the conclusion that the whole model of a Lithuanian Grand Duke only worked if there was a partnership like Jogaila and Vytautas had managed to build. Without that relationship, it looked like there was no way to build a working legal framework. At the same time, Zygmunt had no luck building an anti-Polish coalition, and more importantly, he could not rely on wholehearted support at home. The Lithuanian elite did not agree that he had inherited his throne from his brother. They could clearly remember electing him. He did not have the personal authority to overcome this deficit, and there's a general consensus that he did not have a personality to encourage loyalty. Contemporary reports say that he was unstable and unusually cruel, which alienated many. Besides executing his enemies, he once killed his own men for bringing him bad news. On Palm Sunday, 1440, Nicholas and the royal servants went to Mass, but Zygmunt had the priest come to his bedchamber for a private Mass. A group of conspirators led by Kniaz Ivan Czartoryski entered the room and stabbed him to death. He was buried alongside Vytautas with the appropriate honours. Czartoryski was a Ruthenianized Gediminid who had supported Jogaila until the end, but Lithuanians also joined the plot, including the Palatines of Vilnius and Trakai. Historians generally accept the story that it was a coup against the cruel tyrant caused by Zygmunt's behaviour. There was no obvious successor, and that meant more problems for the child king and his union. Meanwhile, in Poland, following the death of Albert, a faction in Hungary had come out in favour of offering the crown to Władysław, now 15 years old. Albert's widow Elizabeth was pregnant and insisted the child would be a boy, but with the Ottomans at the door, clearly that was not a serious option. The Diet had met on 1st of January 1440 and had discussed two candidates, Władysław and Lazar, the son of the ruler of Serbia. The offer split Polish opinion. Śpietek of Milstein and some of the other juniores were against the council. At an assembly in Kłodzyn on May, they had tried to seize and possibly assassinate Olesnicki, failed in an attempt to capture the city, and then lost a battle with the army in which Śpietek was killed. Sonka was believed to have been behind the coup attempt, but the upshot was that the failure brought her and Olesnicki's factions back together. The majority of the council was now in favour of accepting the Hungarian offer, although Władysław himself was not keen, especially on the part where he had to marry Elizabeth, who was twice his age. Olesnicki went along with the plan, but he also had misgivings. The old practical problems of governing two kingdoms and spending sufficient time in both of them still remained. Hungary was richer and more powerful than Poland, but Ottoman expansion was a major threat. If Władysław accepted, he would clearly be expected to spend considerable time at war in the south. And what would that mean for the Union? Elizabeth did give birth to a boy, who received the excellent name of Laszlo the Posthumous. She grabbed the crown a couple of days before he was born and had a full campaign worked out to secure his hereditary rights. The Hungarian envoys to Poland had different ideas, though. An agreement was reached, and Władysław formally accepted the Hungarian throne. Among the other conditions, he agreed that Hungary's claim to Red Ruthenia and Podolia would be decided by a Hungarian-Polish mediator, something that would clearly have implications for Lithuania. He was to marry Elizabeth and to help Laszlo secure his claims to Bohemia and Austria, but not Hungary. There was no talk of union. These two kingdoms were going to remain separate. In July, Władysław was crowned in Buda. It was made clear to all that, as in Poland, the King of Hungary was elected by the community of the realm and did not merely inherit the throne. At this point, the Jogaila dynasty appeared set to rule a huge expanse of Central and Eastern Europe. But Władysław did not keep his throne for long. Securing it took a 2-year civil war, and once that was done, he had to face the Ottomans. In 1442 and 1443 there were successful campaigns, including taking Sofia, resulting in a 10-year peace treaty and the Ottomans agreeing to hand over Bosnia. Encouraged by this, his councillors wanted him to join a new campaign in 1444, one that was to go all the way to Constantinople. The Pope had persuaded Venice and Genoa to provide naval support, but no one else seemed interested. Without further support, Władysław's army proved inadequate. At Varna, it encountered a much larger Ottoman force. Władysław was killed leading a charge, and the army was destroyed. Laszlo the Posthumous was elected as king. Jogaila and Vytautas had spent decades planning their succession, and there was little to show for it. The Grand Duke had been assassinated. Władysław had spent most of his reign outside of Poland, leaving the council to govern, which, without the king's presence, had led to the erosion of its authority. He had constantly demanded money to pay for the Hungarian Civil War and then his Ottoman campaigns. Complaints about the burden were growing, and people felt like they were returning to chaos. This all also meant that Poland was weakened by internal problems, right when Jogaila was assassinated. Jogaila was still around and had a fair amount of Ruthenian support. Among the Lithuanians, there was not such a clear picture. He had some supporters, including the Palatines of Vilnius and Trakai, but others remembered why they got rid of him the first time around. A number of leading Lithuanians went to Władysław. There is an implication that they were asking him to come and rule Lithuania directly, but Długosz believed they only wanted him to come and sort out the whole situation. They also suggested that Władysław send Kazimierz, now 13, to become Grand Duke. Władysław appears to have given going to Lithuania serious consideration before deciding that he could not avoid going to Hungary. His advisors discussed what to do, and they came up with a different proposal. Instead of Grand Duke, Kazimierz would be sent to Vilnius as Władysław's governor. Kazimierz set out for Vilnius with an entourage of Polish advisors, including a couple of the Olesnicki family. As you might imagine, this decision, which ignored the Grodno Agreement and appeared to reduce Lithuania to a mere province to be administered by a governor, did not impress the Lithuanians. They again rejected Polish attempts to incorporate and dominate, and within days of Kazimierz arriving in Vilnius, they elected him as Grand Duke. In a rare case, both Lithuanian and Polish historians agree that this election represented Lithuania declaring its sovereignty and independence, although they disagree among themselves over whether it broke the union. A point of difference is motivation. Many Polish scholars see Vytautas and his supporters after his death as forming a pro-Polish group in Lithuania. Robert Frost argues that pro-Jagiellonian is the better description. They favoured the union and cooperation with the Poles because of their mutual interests and because they were worried about Lithuanians being gradually swallowed by Ruthenians if they went down the path of Jogaila and his Ruthenian support. They supported the dynasty and the union because they believed that Lithuania had enjoyed several decades of peace in which the boyars, like them, had prospered. They did not wish to join Poland, and they were not really in any way pro-Polish. They had not turned to Poland to solve the situation they had found themselves in. They had gone to Władysław as their legitimate ruler. By rejecting a governor and electing Kazimierz as Grand Duke, they were returning to the Union treaties, which had told them that they would be able to do just that. It was Władysław who had broken the treaties, which said nothing about governors. He had taken bad advice from his Polish councillors, just as he would in Hungary, and had taken up the Polish position that Lithuania had been incorporated into Poland, which had already been roundly rejected by Lithuania. There had not even been an attempt to carry out the consultations referred to in the agreement, and the entourage sent with Kazimierz had no authority to negotiate. The Lithuanians attempted to talk first, and only moved to elect the Grand Duke directly, when the Poles told them that they had nothing to discuss. The election was clear that Kazimierz became Grand Duke, and Władysław remained Supreme Duke, just as it had been with Jogaila and Vytautas. The union therefore remained. Envoys were immediately sent to Hungary to confirm the election with Władysław. The whole coronation issue was not raised. Kazimierz had solid support. The Ruthenians soon fell into line, and Jogaila himself turned up to swear loyalty. A couple of years later, Kazimierz gave him a duchy in Volhynia. He promised Czartoryski that he would not be punished for the assassination of Żegimantas. He reached a settlement with the Kniaz of Smolensk, Yuri Legwinovich, grandson of Algirdas, who kept his independence until he tried to seize more territory and lost the resulting war. Samogitia supported him while retaining autonomy. Kazimierz granted it privileges that became the basis for its special status for the rest of the Union. He returned Kyiv to Alyelko, the son of Volodymyr, who had held it for decades in the previous century. This shored up Ruthenian support, although Alyelko was a governor rather than a kniaz. These moves are sometimes seen as a step backwards from the centralization that was developing under Vytautas. However, the civil war had shown that Lithuania was still divided. The Nikiforovskaya Chronicle, compiled around this time, presents the civil war as a conflict between Ruthenians on one side and Lithuanians and Poles on the other side, refers to Jogaila as the Grand Kniaz of Rus, and appeals to the glory days of Old Rus. So, Kazimier's concessions were a pragmatic response to Lithuania continuing to be a composite, disparate elements. Four years after his election, Władysław died at Varna. Kazimierz clearly had the strongest claim to the Polish throne, and he had Lithuania behind him. Olesnicki recognized this and called an assembly as soon as possible to argue that Kazimierz should be elected. Władysław's body had not been recovered, so there were those in favour of delay. By August, the Szlachta was ready to confirm his election. Sonka sent her thanks to Eloshnitzky. They were all shocked when Kazimierz declined to come and accept the crown. He told the Poles that his brother's fate had saddened him and that he did not have the capacity to take on any new public responsibilities. He stated that he was not refusing the offer, but that he just did not think the time was right. He raised the lack of body as a consideration, asking to wait for further news. In fact, this was a negotiating ploy. Kazimierz knew how strong his position was, and he did not intend to be dictated to. He was only 17, but contemporary accounts showed that this was all his idea, and he had already imposed his authority on the Lithuanian Council, showing his talent for governing. The Poles were in a weak position. The country had been practically without a king for years of absentee rule already. They wanted change. Despite this, Olesnitsky made a mess of the first round. He and Vincenti Kot met Kazimierz in Grodno, offered an entirely incorporationist vision of the Union, and proposed that he take the throne in exchange for Poland reaffirming the treaties. They ended with a threat that if he did not turn up to be crowned by 5th of December 1445, they would look elsewhere. The threat made Sonka nervous, and she tried to mediate, without any success. Długosz blames the Lithuanian elite, claiming that Kazimierz wanted to agree, but they were saying that Lithuania would return to chaos. The Poles began to make concessions. They had thought it would be simple. They would just summon Kazimierz and he would come running. Now, instead of imposing a governor on Lithuania, they found themselves forced to persuade the Lithuanians to agree that their Grand Duke could become a king. When the Lithuanians talked about elections and the community of the realm, they were citing Polish political principles. It was hard to argue against them. At the end of November, all the elite of Lithuania gathered in Vilnius to show their support for Kazimierz. It appointed an embassy of 4 Lithuanians and 2 Ruthenians to conduct negotiations. They informed Poland that Kazimierz ruled Lithuania by hereditary right and had full power, and that upon Władysław's death he had become Supreme Duke. While he was not yet ready to take up the Polish throne, he would not allow anyone else to do so. The situation dragged on for another 2 years. There were attempts to nominate a couple of Germans, but no one really wanted them. Finally, the Poles had to capitulate. They were forced to acknowledge Kazimierz as Grand Duke. There were no incorporationist declarations. Kazimierz promised to maintain the union of the 2 polities that he was joining together. The Poles had to agree that Kazimierz could live wherever he pleased and conduct his court in any language he chose. This meant that he would always have a Lithuanian presence, rather than being surrounded by Polish councillors. He was crowned before the Polish nobles and Lithuanian lords, including Jogaila. There would be no new Grand Duke in Vilnius. Kazimierz now became King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.